This video shows students how to download and use the Jupyter notebooks for SISC 124. On the OnCue page for SISC 124, find the Content section, find the download link for the notes, and then download the notes. Take the zip file and copy or move it to your SISC 124 directory. Extract the contents of the file. When you extract the contents of the file, I recommend you do not put it in a separate folder, but instead put it in the SISC 124 folder. The reason for doing this is that every zip file that you download in this course is going to contain another folder called Notes, and the notes will all go into there. So for example, Part 2, there'll be a Part 2 folder in here. If you create a separate folder every time, your notes will be in separate folders, which is also fine. Inside the folder, there's a file called toc.ipynb. That's the table of contents file for the Python notebooks. For the Jupyter notebooks. At this point, then, you need to start Jupyter. So the process is similar for Windows and Mac. In Windows, you're going to want to start an Anaconda prompt. In Mac, assuming you've installed Anaconda correctly, you should just open up a terminal. Then, again, in both Windows and Mac, you want to type conda activate beaker X. So this will activate the beaker X environment for Anaconda. And then you want to start beaker X. So you just type beaker X and you press enter. And this should start a Jupyter server in your web browser. In your web browser, find your SISC 124 directory, and then find the notes directory, and then click on the table of contents file. And here's the table of contents for the first part of SISC 124. So the Jupyter notebooks are meant to be read in order, but feel free to jump around and look at the various notebooks in whatever order you like. But I recommend you do start with a first Java program, Hello World, first, so that you learn how to use the Jupyter notebooks. Okay, so when we click on the link, it opens up the notebook. So the notebooks are organized into what are called cells. So if I click right in the notebook, you'll see that different parts of the notebook are highlighted. Each one of these is what Jupyter calls a cell. Sometimes the cells just separate logical sections of the notebook. So for example, this talks about Python, this talks about Java, so I place them in different cells. Other times, though, the cells are code cells, so anything in gray is a code cell, which can include programming code. Okay, so let's go through this notebook very quickly. The start of this notebook basically tells you in Python, if you'd like to create a Hello World program, you would just need one line of code that would look like that. For the part 1 of the notebooks, there will be some Python code in many of the notebooks. And this is to remind you of what a concept looks like in Python, and then I tell you what the concept looks like in Java. If this is Hello World in Python, well, that's what it looks like in Java, right? So it's quite a bit more verbose in Java. In other words, you have to write quite a bit more code. But at the heart of it, there's this one line here that is responsible for printing out the string Hello World. Now, as I mentioned before, Jupyter notebooks can contain code, and this is where this is one reason why a Jupyter notebook is so much more. As I mentioned before, a Jupyter notebook can contain code, and this is one of the reasons why a Jupyter notebook is a lot more interactive than a paper notebook. You can actually edit and run the code inside the notebook. So here we have a code cell. It begins with this %sign syntax. Now, a %sign inside of at the start of a code cell is indicating a Jupyter command. So if you look up here in the right-hand corner, you'll see that this notebook is configured to run Java. So code cells in this notebook will by default use Java. If you want to use Python in this particular notebook, I need to issue a command to the Jupyter server telling it that I want to use Python. And that happens to look like %sign Python. And then after that, you can include some Python code. Once you've finished writing code in a cell, you can run the cell. And in this case, eventually the string hello world will show up underneath the cell. So the first time you use a Python cell in a Java notebook, it will probably take a few seconds for the output for the cell to finish running. Now in the notebooks, you'll often find exercises. Sometimes the exercises will be in the immediately after a section of a notebook, and sometimes they'll be at the end of the notebook. So here, because we just learned how to use a Python cell in a notebook for the first time, there's an exercise. So it says to edit the cell so that it prints out a different message. And so that's easy to do. You just go up, click in the cell, and then just edit the text in the cell. So here we'll say goodbye world. Once you've edited the text, you can run it again. Right? And not surprisingly, it prints goodbye world. Exercise 2 says make sure that there's a syntax error and see what happens. So that's fine. Let's delete the right hand parenthesis and run the cell. And not surprisingly, the interpreter complains that there is an error. Right? So we can fix the error, rerun the cell, and we get the string, we get the output goodbye world. Now, the other thing that makes the Jupyter notebooks a lot more interactive than a regular notebook is that you can add text and code to the notebook. So once you've downloaded the notebooks, they're yours. You can edit them as much as you like. So if I want to add a note or a reminder to myself about something, I just insert another cell. So I'm going to insert the cell below that cell, and I get a cell here. You'll notice that when you insert a cell, it's always a code cell. So if I want to add text, I need to change the cell type, to Markdown. Markdown is it's what's called a markup language. So you can add special commands to the text that you're typing, and then when the Jupyter notebook renders the cell, it can do things like have bold headings or numbered lists or things like that. If you want to learn how to use the Markdown language, just do a web search for it. It's a very simple language to learn. But if you just want to add text, that's fine. You just go ahead and type. So here I'm going to make a note to myself about what happens when there's a syntax error in a Python cell. So when there is a syntax error, and after you've added the text, you can run the cell and it will render it into the document. After you've made changes to the document, you can save the document. So if I save the document and close it, when I go back and reopen it, the changes that I made will be included in the document. So now you can make notes to yourself as well as running code. Okay, so let's see how to run some Java code. So as I mentioned before, all of these notebooks are configured with Java as the default code cell. There's the Java program that corresponds to Hello World. So if I click on it and run that program, it doesn't print Hello World. Instead, what you get is this funny output here, which is completely expected. So Java is a compiled language, which means if you have a complete Java program in a cell, Jupyter has to compile the program. So what you're seeing here is the output of the compilation process. This is basically indicating to us that the class Hello World has been successfully compiled. Jupyter does not automatically run the main method in the class. So to do that, I need another cell, which explicitly calls the main method. So we click in the other cell and we run that, and not surprisingly, hello world shows up. Now there's an exercise, right? It says the hello world program is repeated below. Edit the program so that it prints something else. So we'll edit that and run that. Right? Compiles the program, run the program. Right? It prints out goodbye world. If you put a syntax error or in the code, when you run the code, it doesn't compile. Right? So now it's telling us that there's a missing bracket. So go back and put the bracket in, recompile the code, and then rerun that main method. Now you might have noticed that when we ran the main method, we got the string, we have the output goodbye world, but then there's also another output cell that prints out the word null. If you don't mind, you just ignore it and not worry about it. If you don't like seeing null, it tells you you can run this code cell and that will deactivate the output of null. So let's open up another notebook, the second notebook. So the second and all other notebooks at the top will always contain that particular, will contain a cell that contains that code that disables the output of null. So when you open up another notebook, you can just run that cell and then you don't have to worry about null being printed out. To summarize the contents of this video, the table of contents lists the notebooks for the course. You should probably proceed through the notebooks in the order that they are presented the first time through the course. A Jupyter notebook consists of cells. Some cells contain text. Some cells contain code. You can edit a code cell simply by clicking in the cell and editing the code. Code cells are meant to be run, so you should run a cell when you encounter it the first time and when you edit it. You can insert your own code cells if you like. Simply insert the cell above or below the current cell. If you want a Python cell, make sure to include the command %sign Python at the beginning of the cell. You can also add in text cells. To add a text cell, insert a cell, and then change the cell type to Markdown. Then click in the cell, add your own text. For example, you might add in notes to yourself, or you might add in questions that you want to ask a TA or the instructor, and then run the cell. When you run the cell, it will render the cell into the document. To get the most out of these notebooks, it's important that you use them in an interactive fashion. So again, when you see a code cell, make sure that you run the cell. When you have questions or you want to make notes to yourself, make sure to insert your own markdown cells. After making changes to the notebook, press save and your changes will be saved so that when you open up the notebook the next time, your edits will be in the notebook.